started, Gary, of course, thank you for being my point of contact and my steward as I prepared for this. Kata Schwain, who I know is not able to be here today, has become a good friend and has been very supportive over the years and reached out to me, in fact, about this event. And I always love seeing her. But can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's great.
Thanks to the Northfield News. If you didn't see it, they did a piece on this event this weekend. And thanks to Content Books for being here today. Thanks to Paula Granquist and KYMN Radio, who did interviewed me on Friday morning and spotlighted this event as well. So also I have special guests. My mother, Ann Romstead, and my sister, Rebecca Romstead, came down from the cities today. And yeah, my mom has been, let me just put it this way, it's a wonderful thing when your mom is your biggest fan. And she comes to all of my events, despite knowing how many stories about her I'm about to tell. And despite knowing how many stories about her I put in my books, she is one of the reasons that I became a writer, as well as my father, who is no longer with us. But I was raised in a book-loving and storytelling family, and I think that makes all the difference. A few things about me. So thank you for the wonderful introduction. I am a proud St. Olaf graduate, class of 1993, and when Kata contacted me, she mentioned that there would be, former faculty in the audience, and I thought, okay, am I going to approach this like I'm nervous, or am I going to approach this like a good St. Olaf student and do my homework and prepare and come up with something fresh, a fresh idea to set myself apart? So you can guess what I did. I did both. I prepared with nerves and with fresh ideas. She said, you can just do any presentation that you've done in the past, but not as a good St. Olaf student, not down in Northfield. Northfield, I graduated in 1993, which if you're like me, you are currently doing the math to try and figure out how old I am, and I will make it easy on you. I am 52, almost 53, and so not only have I been coming down to Northfield since the age of 18, but quite frankly, I was raised coming to Northfield. So Northfield as a town to me has this beautiful, wide, it's full of memories for me. We drove down in all sorts of weather. I had memories of looking specifically for the steer. When we saw the big steer, I knew we were getting somewhere. I'm old enough to remember when the road sign for Carleton College and St. Olaf College got added. I think President George had his picture in the newspaper. I'm old enough to remember that. I have memories of coming to Northfield and sticking my finger in the holes where the James Gang bullets hit the wall. And I still do it to this day. There go my notes. Still do it to this day. And my mom can correct this, but speaking of stories, there is family folklore that holds that when the surviving members of the gang fled, they went south, back to Missouri, correct, Mom?
Well, I thought it was before they got to Northfield.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But it's one or the other.
It would have to be one or the other for them to come in contact. Right. Well, family folklore is that my great-grandmother, on my father's maternal side, gave them water and remarked on what nice young men they were when they stopped at her farm. And my grandmother used to love to tell that story because she thought it was funny how nice they were, how nice her family thought they were. So anyway, Northfield for me is always a joy, except during finals week, and always larger. I would say in my head it's almost larger than life, and so it's a huge honor for me to be asked to be here today. And let's hope that I did well, that I do you well by coming to this. So a few other things. I am 4th generation a St. Olaf graduate. My great-grandfather, Mostrom, lived in Old Main and started what was the first St. Olaf Glee Club. More family folklore. Family folklore holds that F. Malleus Christiansen used to call my great-grandfather the first conductor of the St. Olaf Choir. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Good. Now, let's add to that my brother and I are St. Olaf choir babies. Our parents met in the choir, got married as a result, had us as a result, and now let's spin that tale further and talk about how my brother and I both auditioned for the St. Olaf choir, and neither one of us made it past the first round of auditions. That is full circle. We had other talents. And I will say, even more, digging into that story even a little bit more, that stung a little bit, having come from a mother who was even a soloist for the St. Olaf Choir, and who basically bred in us the holy music that was Christmas Festival every year. I drank it in, it was in my pores, it was in my soul by the time I turned 18, and joined the Manitou Singers with my white robe and my little red bow, and to never really attain the glorydom that is the St. Olaf Choir always stung a little bit, and I am one to hold a grudge. But I will say that I got over that grudge, and I finally let it go when in 2018, the St. Olaf magazine did a multi-page spread on me after my first book was published, and I'll take that any day. So, thank you very much, St. Olaf magazine, for healing my deepest wounds. I really appreciate that. Yeah, oh, and I should mention, for anyone that this matters, my husband and I have raised 3 boys. One is down in Tennessee, becoming a audio engineer, getting his Bachelor of Science. One is a gopher, but I have one left, and he is ripe for the picking. He is a junior in high school, and his favorite classes, in case this matters to anyone, are chemistry and German. Just saying. Just saying. I got one chance left to get an Oli. Or Carl. I'd take a Carl, and it would be fine too. So, coming back here, as I think I have established, means an awful lot to me. And when I was preparing this, I immediately thought of one of the most sort of offhand, unexpected moments in my college career that has, in retrospect, gone on to shape my life. And we go back to the fall, for that moment, we go back to the fall of 1993 in a classroom above Northfield Library, looking out as the leaves changed and hearing Professor Pamela Schwant assign to us the book One Writer's Beginnings by Eudora Welty, which, whether or not you've read the book, Eudora Welty is, of course, a Southern writer, and One Writer's Beginnings is an autobiographical book about her journey from childhood to becoming a writer. And throughout the years, Professor Schwant, who actually became a friend and a mentor for me in the long run, and I'll come back to that, but she used it as a tool to teach the expository essay. And reading that book, it sprang something loose in me. And I would always, in so many endeavors throughout my life, have gone back to Welty's foundational premise of that book, which is write what you know, talk what you know, and the power of story. And I know when I say that reading that book in 1993 sprang something loose for me. I know it sounds that I'm going to say 5 years later I came up with my debut novel and I've been an author ever since. That's not true. 25 years later, I came out with my debut novel. But that book continued to inform my approach to storytelling over the course of what was a 20-year career in corporate communication. And over the course of that, I became known as a person who, I eventually became very skilled at coaching executives on their ability to transform information into a story and to stand and be authentic in front of their colleagues or their employees or their teams. And as a part of that, I became very adept at listening to them as speakers and as storytellers and being able to write in their voices. Because, you know, when you receive a letter from the president of a company or an organization, or, you know, even credit card notice, and there's a statement from the CEO and president on the front of the cover, that's never written by that person. It is supposed to sound as if that person wrote it. That is the skill, but it's always written by a person like myself on their communication team. And what I didn't know at the time, as I was teaching them to try and be more authentic and teaching them that data was dry, but stories and outcomes and evolution was a story, and humans grasp stories. What I didn't realize at the time, but I recognize now in retrospect, was that all of that business experience was preparation on my part to go on and write in character voice. And it wasn't until I made the switch to fiction that I realized what a great gift that was. And eventually, unfortunately, Pam Schwant died about 10 months before my first novel, Evergreen Tidings from the Baumgartners, came out. And Jack, her husband Jack, I made sure Jack got a copy and signed it. And Jack is one of about a handful of people on this earth who is allowed to call me Gretchen. As I said, they became mentors and friends, and I don't think Pamela ever called me Gretchen, but Jack had a fondness for calling me Gretchen, which only my parents called me Gretchen, and Jack, and now my husband. So you can see that these people are very important to me. That I give Jack Schwant still the permission to call me Gretchen. Anyway, my regret is that I was never able to place this book in Pam's hands or in my father's hands, because I do consider those two people without whom I may not have ever taken a step forward. Because Pam not only became a mentor, but she put Eudora Welty's book in my hands, and it was forever burned into my brain, the power of story and the power of writing and speaking about what you know. So that is a very long-winded way of coming around to what I'm going to talk about today. And I'm going to tell you 3 or 4 if we have time. I love to get long-winded. It's a hobby of mine. And so I'm eyeing this clock to make sure that I don't go too far over with time. If we have time, I'll tell you 4 stories, but definitely 3 about real-life experiences and how they made their way into the books. And then I'll read you, we'll do a before and after thing. I'll tell you the stories, I'll tell you who the real characters are, and then I'll read to you how they evolved and became parts of the book. But let me first read you a few of my favorite quotes from one writer's beginnings. This I love. I love how Welty writes about the convergence of memory and story. She writes, "The memory is a living thing. It too is in transit. But during its moment, all that is remembered joins and lives. The old and the young, the past and the present, the living and the dead." I love that idea of memory being a living thing, because we all know how it changes over time and how we interpret it differently over time. She goes on to say, in another passage she writes, "It is our inward journey that leads us through time, forward or back, seldom in a straight line, most often spiraling. Each of us is moving, changing with respect to others. As we discover, we remember. And remembering, we discover. And most intensely do we experience this when our separate journeys converge. Our living experience at those meeting points is one of the charged, dramatic fields of fiction. And it's that line, as we discover, we remember, and in remembering, we discover. I go back to that quite often, and I'm kind of in love with that concept. Because I have found that as a writer, especially in the dark moments when the words won't come and you're alone with your screen and it feels like a showdown more than an enjoyable experience, the breakthroughs and the most enjoyable moments have come when I'm revisiting a memory and I discover something new in it, or it informs something in the story, the fully fictional story that I'm trying to tell. There's that dance, that interplay there, and I'm continually fascinated by it. So here's the first story that I'll tell you about my book, about my first book. This story informs my debut novel, which came out in 2018, called Evergreen Tidings from the Baumgartners. And the matriarch in the story evolved out of something that experiences that went way back to my childhood. And I remember, almost as early as I can read, waiting for, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and in the 70s and 80s, the stack of Christmas letters, not just the photo cards that we've reverted to these days, but the stack of Christmas letters was always thick, especially I grew up in a pastor's family. I grew up as a pastor's kid, which big surprise, I want to say all. But my parents had moved around congregation to congregation by the time that we settled in Twin Cities. And so I don't know if our stack was larger than usual, but I would say we easily got 100, 120 letters per year. And the child in me was always curious. I always opened them up. I always read them. I devoured them like books. And over time, I discovered that there were a few doozies that came every year with very exciting details included ad nauseum, at least exciting to the author, to the person who wrote the letters. And one in particular was particularly, I've been using that word a lot, one every year went over the top and was the cherry on the Christmas letter sundae. And every year I watched for that particular letter to come. And it was so effusive, and it was so full of joy, and so full of false modesty. And I hate to brag, but sentences that began with, "You know that I'm loath to toot our own horn." And every year, I recognized a little bit more and a little bit more about what a treat this letter was, in a way that the author, of course, never intended for it to be a treat. Then, with time, the letter came with a second side. And on the second side, or if it was an especially juicy year, it would be letter on both sides, and then a second page included in the letter with newspaper clippings featuring the family that the mother had always submitted to the local newspaper, and then, like a good PR agent, would save the clippings through the year, tape them to a blank piece of paper, and take them over to the mimeograph machine. I mean, we're going back to mimeograph, not even Xerox machines, and print them out so that there was journalistic proof of all of the accomplishments that she was also highlighting in the letter. And my mom is really, really trying to control herself right now because she knows exactly what these letters were. And that there's something wrong with her daughter, that she enjoyed them so much. And then, let's fast forward to somewhere around middle school when I was fully clued into these letters, fully clued into what little treasures they were, and a snarky teenage girl. Couple that with a father who was a wonderful storyteller and someone who loved to laugh. And we began what became a tradition every year of opening the letter together and then sitting in the living room and having dramatic readings of them aloud. And then eventually the letters stopped, and I'm so sad. But before they stopped, the family had one capstone letter that I will never forget. And in this letter, it was the Christmas letter equivalent to a mic drop. She couldn't have done any better, and then she was out. It was a single page of photographed newspaper clippings of all the family's accomplishments from the year, and then over the top, written in Sharpie and of course Xeroxed, were the words, "No time to write this year, off to Rome to visit Amy and Raoul." Now we know who Amy is because she is the eldest daughter and she gets lots of press time. But who's Raoul? And why are you, we don't know anything about what they're doing in Rome. All we know is that no time to write this year, off to Rome to visit Amy and Raoul. And that was the last that we heard. And that letter came in probably 1990, would be my guess. And so from 1990 to 2016, when I began writing Evergreen Tidings from the Baumgartners, that voice lived in my head and it was a seed that got planted and it grew, and that voice grew until somewhere in maybe the 2010s, that voice was so loud I used to hear it while I was doing things like taking a shower or riding my bike or washing the dishes. She had become no longer the woman who used to write these letters. She was no longer that real woman. She had become a full-blown character in herself, on her own, and she was now speaking to me. And I remember having a moment in the shower one day where she just would not stop talking to me. And I said to myself, the only way I'm going to get this woman out of my head is if I put her on paper. And lo and behold, she doesn't talk to me anymore. As soon as the book was published, she was happy, she's out in the world, and she became the character of Violet Baumgartner, who sees herself very much as her family's PR agent. She has a brilliant daughter who does no wrong, and she has a brilliant husband who can do no wrong. And I am going to read to you right now from the voice that began in my head as a very young child to the woman and the character that Violet became. So this book actually features Christmas letters scattered throughout the book, a sampling of Violet's Christmas letters throughout the book, and this is the first letter of the book. Christmas 2017. Dearest loved ones far and near, Evergreen Tidings from the Baumgartners. By the time you open this letter, I'm sure it will be old news that 2017 has been a monumental year for our family, one that we're certain to treasure until the end of our days. So tonight, as I sit tucked into my warm house with a steaming cup of Christmas tea, I feel nothing but blessed. And while I know that my modest little Christmas correspondences can't hold a candle to the day-to-day joys and sorrows of your lives, I do hope you'll indulge this meek attempt to share a glimpse of our year with you. The biggest Baumgartner news, of course, is dear Ed's retirement from biotech after 30 extraordinary years. How proud we are of you, Ed, though you know I'm loath to brag. I can hardly constrain myself. How can the good Lord expect me to go humbly about while congratulatory letters and cards flood our home? I can't help but repeat here what's been said to us in those notes, that millions of people around the world are living healthier, happier lives because of this dear man's research. and to think that I am the lucky girl who gets to wake up next to him every day. Let's see. She goes on, she goes on, she goes on. Oh Lord, does Violet Baumgartner go on until she is interrupted by the telephone and the mayhem of the book ensues. So that's memory number one. Memory number two, well, let me ease into memory number two by talking about the fact that the number one question, this book actually did quite well, and was a fair bit divisive. People actually loved Violet, or they couldn't stand Violet to the extent that they almost couldn't finish the book. But not a person who finished the book didn't come up to me without saying, I know Violet. I have a Violet in my life. And only one of those many, many, many dozens of people who know a Violet did she say, I am Violet. Only one person ever had the either courage or self-awareness to admit that she herself was a Violet and was proud of it. It was really quite interesting. But the number one question that I get about this book is people come up to me almost with a level of concern, and they say, please tell me that your mother was not the basis for Violet Baumgartner. And my mom loves that question so often, and she often came to my book events for Evergreen Tidings from the Baumgartners, dressed head to toe in lavender and violet. She had an outfit, folks. She had an outfit. Today, yes, and she had a hat. She had a hat. And I am always pleased to say that no, my mother was not the inspiration for Violet. However, my mother was the inspiration for the matriarch of my next book, my second book, which was The Kids Are Gonna Ask. And let me tell you a foundational story that informed what became this character named Maggie McClare. One of the most prominent memories, descriptive memories that I have of my mother was a Sunday afternoon. And as I already mentioned, I was a pastor's kid. And Sunday afternoons in our house almost universally meant that someone was coming over for lunch. Our family room, our living room, was without fail full of people that I didn't know. Any random day I could come home from school or come home from wherever I had been out and find a new person in my living room telling stories and hearing my father laughing hysterically and my dad telling stories back. And my mother never, I think it bugged you a little bit, but you were such a good sport. And my mother's signature for many years was she had an endless supply of wheat thins or Triscuits and Merck's port wine cheese spread. Does anybody remember that? It was like marbly pink. Yes, eventually we graduated to chips and salsa. We went international, folks, with chips and salsa. But that my mom had this endless supply of Merck's Triscuits and wheat thins and cheese spread to entertain the people who would inevitably come to our house. We had a house that was a drop-by house. People that my father and my mother were people gatherers. And I do remember one Sunday afternoon, I had been informed that people were coming to lunch. Mom had been at church doing 5,000 of the 5,000 things as she did every Sunday. Dad was still wrapping up. But I had gone home, and these friends from out of town came over, and Mom was nowhere to be found, except that I did discover a note on the kitchen table that said, had to dash to the grocery store, be home in a bit. So I was somewhat adept by this point, I was probably in middle school, to entertaining random people in my family room. But as the minutes ticked away into 20 minutes, a half an hour, 40 minutes, I started thinking to myself, what did Mom have to get from the grocery store that is taking her so long? Come an hour, and I'm still entertaining these people, and Dad comes home from church. Now, it's an odd thing that Dad ever beats Mom home from church, and I'm just relieved because I have run out of things as a middle school girl to talk about with these people that I barely know. Dad's home, finally, maybe 10, 15 minutes after Dad gets home. So this is an hour and 15 minutes after lunch is supposed to have begun. Mom comes home with a trunk full of groceries and a new piano bench. Because there was a sidewalk sale, and I have been looking for a new piano bench since I can't even tell. This was $20, can you believe it? So I had to make room, and then I got talking to this guy, and he was from Cannon Falls. And wouldn't you know, he knows so-and-so who knows so-and-so. And the next thing, she's just chatting away and buying new piano benches, and had to buy all the ingredients for lunch because we hadn't started lunch at all. And that is my mom. That was my childhood, coming home to a living room full of people that I didn't know and just learning to roll with it and learning what they had to say and recognizing that stories were going to come at me whether I wanted them to or not. So this people gatherer eventually became the foundation for Maggie McClare, who was the matriarch in the second book, The Kids Are Gonna Ask. Now, The Kids Are Gonna Ask is about 17-year-old twins who grew up with their eccentric grandmother and their single mother, who dies tragically in a car accident before they ever find out who their biological father was. And so they start a podcast to find him. And the podcast goes viral and their world gets turned upside down. But at the heart is this wonderful, magical woman named Maggie McClare, and the house and the atmosphere that she has created in which these twins are growing up. And here's how I describe Maggie and her husband, George, who by the time the book opens has passed away. Maggie and George had been people collectors together, and for more than 20 years, their house hummed with new acquaintances. There was Officer Priestley, who'd helped Maggie retrieve the contents of her purse from the lanes of Interstate 35 after she'd driven away with it on the roof of her car. Also my mother. I think we were at Bush Lake or Buck Hill, one or the other, all over the interstate. And Richard Endries, who developed the Cough It Up for Lung Cancer Research advertising campaign back when George was on the board of the Minnesota Cancer Foundation. They'd met Alice Overberg, who raised money for the Minnesota Orchestra, and Tilly Tillis, who styled the blunt silver white bob for which Alice was so famous. The McClare house was a revolving door, as was mine. There's one more reading I want to give. This is specifically about Maggie. This is the grandson, Thomas, describing his grandmother, Maggie. For starters, grandmother was always bringing home strays, people she treated like old friends, even though she'd just met them 20 minutes ago. Not that everyone was annoying. How else would Thomas have gotten to eat dinner with the former ambassador to Uganda if his grandmother hadn't met her shopping for fresh mung bean sprouts at the Vietnamese grocery? The problem was, Maggie thought almost everyone was fascinating, which meant they'd also had to spend an entire dinner listening to her podiatrist talk about foot fungus. I met, in my own living room, I met everyone from missionaries to Africa, to the former ambassador to Ethiopia, to a woman who, over wine, told the story of her, entire story of her hysterectomy, which was also the occasion for me to run to my children's dictionary and try and look up the word hysterectomy, which it wasn't included, but I did eventually figure out what it was. And it's not until, as Welty describes so well in her book, it's not until you grow up and you look back on these stories that you recognize the characters that entered your life and that they were there for a purpose. And I understand my resiliency in such a different way, having had the chance to now put it into books and create characters out of them. So, one of the things that I have done as an author is all three of my first three books. My fourth book is coming out in May, and it's complete. It's in the publisher's hands, so to speak. But my first three books are set exclusively in Minnesota. And one of the reasons for that is because I'm so happy here. And I had such a great childhood here. Despite the fact, after graduating in 1993, I moved away and swore I would never come back. Never, ever, ever. That lasted 17 years. Until, as my husband says, she heard the siren call that Minnesota women often hear, and we came home. And it wasn't until I came home that I actually started my fiction career. It wasn't until I heard these voices here again and recognized the people who shaped me that I knew my voice and that I knew these were the characters that I wanted to create and tell stories about. So my third book, which came out a year ago, September of 2022, the Book Haters Book Club. It is about an iconic bookstore in the Lynn Lake area of Minneapolis, and it's called the Over the Rainbow Bookshop. And it was founded by best friends who met back in 1979 because they were competing booksellers. One man named Elliot had a business called Books on Bikeback, which I love because I was just talking to, is it Steve?
Yeah.
Yeah, Steve, about how you, the Northfield Public Library, have two mobile libraries. One is the Bookmobile and one is Book on Bikes Back. And that is exactly how the co-founders of my bookstore, the Over the Rainbow Bookshop, met. Because Elliot, one founder, had a bookstore that he called Books on Bike Back, which was exactly what you have, just a display that he biked around town and would open up and sell at places like Lake Harriet and places where people gathered. And his co-founder, Irma, had $500 in her pocket, with which she bought an old milk truck and painted it purple with yellow swirls, and she called it Books on Wheels. And they were competitors who eventually joined together. And while writing this book, one of the challenges that I tackled was how to make Minneapolis how to bring the Minneapolis that I knew as a child to life on the page, more than just describing it, how to make it almost a character in itself. And so, and I also was faced with the question, how do I create a place and an atmosphere that it only seems natural that a bookstore like Over the Rainbow would grow and flourish. And to do that, I of course went back to my childhood in that area. And my childhood was full of summers at Lake Harriet and summers driving around the lakes, and that water was such a cultural element to every season in Minnesota. And I kept digging and I kept digging and I kept digging, and I thought, is there a quintessential Minneapolis moment? And what I came up with the Aquatennial. Okay, that's a quintessential Minnesota event. What about the Aquatennial? Is there anything even more quintessential about it? And yes, what is more quintessential about Minneapolis in the summer than the Aquatennial, and the part of the Aquatennial that I loved most, which was the annual milk carton boat race at what was then called Lake Calhoun. So one of the wonders that we have now is that all of those memories don't have to just live in my head, they also live on YouTube. So in my research, I went and I looked to see if anyone had ever captured video of either 1970s or 1980s milk carton boat race, and lo and behold, I found it. Wrapped up in that memory was the fact that I used to watch that Real People show all the time. I thought it was fantastic. I thought it was excellent journalism. So as I was writing the story, I knew that these two characters of mine, I wanted to set their foundational moment, the moment that they met and changed their histories and the course of the book. I knew I wanted that to be a quintessential moment, and so that's when I, decided, okay, I'm going to have them meet at the milk carton boat race, and then I decided, can I find the milk carton boat race? Sure enough, I did, and here's what came out of it. This is Elliot telling the story of the day he and his soon-to-be partner met. So that afternoon in July, I was having a fantastic sales day. Glasses help. I was having a fantastic sales day, nothing but a few, this is 1979, I should say. Nothing but a few scattered romances left on the bike. Minneapolis was in the heart of its annual Aquatennial Festival, and this was one of the most popular days, the milk carton boat race at Lake Calhoun. What the what, you ask? It was a race for boats made entirely of empty milk cartons. Stop if you need a minute, or go to YouTube and type Lake Calhoun Milk Carton Boat Race, because there you can watch the very event where I met my leading lady, thanks to the late 70s smash hit TV show, Real People. They'd come to film a segment, and all of Minneapolis knew about it. The tube socks and the terry cloth tank tops were out in force. The beach was mobbed, teenagers preened for the cameras, and the wax holding the milk cartons together was melting quickly in the July heat. Did I mention the tube socks? Lord, how we ever survived. With my inventory essentially sold out and time to waste before the boats hit the water, I wandered over to my purple competitor. Remember, she painted her milk truck purple. My purple competitor to introduce myself, and behold, there I found the woman in the orange and yellow polyester culottes in all her sweaty glory. I'll admit to being instantly transfixed. I never was able to understand the attraction. It wasn't sexual, but it was fierce. The need to know her consumed me immediately. I remember her first words. Well, if it isn't the handsome and wise Mr. Books on Pikeback. Charm, that was Irma's superpower. Would you like a flavor ice? I keep a cooler full. Now, if you've heard of Minnesota Nice, but never experienced it, there you go. You're welcome, my direct competitor, and she didn't even look me up and down before inviting me in and giving me treats. Southern hospitality, my glorious beep. You're good, but you don't have the lock. How many copies of the Thornbirds have you sold today? I asked. About 5. Michener's Chesapeake, too, she added. Way more copies than I sold last week. I suppose the Aquatennial has everyone thinking about water. Just before the race began, she closed up shop, and we climbed on top of the truck's roof for a clear view of the lake. Irma was rooting for the hamster wheel to win. I was a sucker for the Viking ship. I don't think you'll have to worry about me next summer, Irma sighed, all but admitting defeat, though we'd met less than an hour before. I'm losing money, and I'm wasting hours of my life sitting in gas lines. I'm sorry to hear that. You have a glorious book truck. I only pedal because it keeps my legs in great shape. That last part wasn't exactly true, but I knew better than to pile on when a woman was down. And I'll never carry the inventory you can. Irma began to wiggle her shoulders and kick her feet in a sort of rooftop jig. They say those who can do the can't can, and those who can't can just watch. I think I want to marry you. No, you don't. She took my hand anyway. But something tells me we're at that final scene in Casablanca. Do you feel it? I do. Then I raised her knuckles to my lips and kissed them. Hallelujah, and pass the Jell-O salad. So that to me was Minneapolis in its 1970s heyday, everything from the tube socks to the terry cloth tank tops to Jell-O salad and the milk carton boat race. And my fourth book, which comes out in May, is the first book that I've written that is not set in Minnesota, though it is based on my days in California in the early 90s when I decided to jet away from the Midwest and start my adventures as a whole new person that would last me 17 years in the Bay Area. But given that I started this journey with, thanks to Welty, I dropped my notes so many times, they're now all over the place. I'm gonna let her finish with a quote. Can you tell I'm not a super organized person? I'm like, okay. Welty writes, long before I wrote stories, I listened for stories. Listening for them is something more acute than listening to them. I suppose it's an early form of participation in what goes on. Listening children know stories are there. When their elders sit and begin, children are just waiting and hoping for one to come out like a mouse from its hole. I love that. And it speaks to what I experienced all those years ago, despite, waiting with strangers and offering them glasses of water while my mother got her new piano bench, and I listened to the horrors of a hysterectomy, though I really had no idea what part of the body that horror was coming out of, and I grew to know, like Welty says any child would do, I grew to listen for those stories as they popped their heads out of their holes. So if you have a story, I would love to hear it, but you have been warned, it may end up in one of my books. So, anyway, I would love to answer your questions if you have any, or if you care to stand up and share a story, that would be fine as well.
I think it's interesting that your brother, 3 years older, who eventually became and is a very successful pastor, always hid from the company. He was old enough to hold his own, but he hid and left you holding him back.
I would like someone to put that in writing, and we will mail it in a postcard right now. Thank you. Yeah, well, I guess it served me well.
That's the guy that noticed it.
Yeah, so. Go ahead. I can tell Paula's got a question on her lips.
I know, because we ran out of time on the show, so of course I have lots of questions. One of the things that Elliot says in his book, Haters Book Club newsletter, he has quotes down at the bottom, and one of them was, every book lover knows the novel that knocked them off their axis, as well as the one that set them right again. Do you have examples from your life about the novels that knocked you off your axis or set you right again?
Right. Oh, yeah, that's such a good question. And I've been asked before, and I think every time I have a different answer.
That's okay.
So Elliot, one of the reasons it's called the Book Haters Book Club is Elliot is a bookseller who becomes known for his philosophy that all it takes to make a book hater into a book lover is putting the right book in their hands at exactly the right time. Because I believe in that philosophy. I've seen it happen in my own life, and I've seen it happen to other people. And he ends his newsletters with little quotes about books, and that's one of them. Every book lover knows the book that's knocked them off their axis and set them right again. One of the books that I tend to return to is A Prayer for Owen Meany. I have a love of very quirky characters, and there's something about that book that, even though it's problematic in some ways, I feel better about whatever I'm facing when I'm read about a kid who's got everything going against him and still meets the day with a smile and a can-do attitude, but not in such a cheesy way as I just put it. There's something that brings me back about that book, that it has the turnkey, I guess, for hope. When I need hope in my life, I think it's got a secret turnkey to unlock it for me. Do you know a book that sets you
Yes.
right?
It was Elizabeth Berg, what was the title? Talk Before Sleep.
Oh.
It's a book about a circle of girlfriends, and one of the women gets breast cancer, and how they came together to help her on her journey. And
Yeah.
I had just graduated college and got to pick a book that I got to read by myself. Like, I didn't have a syllabus that told me what to read, and that was
Right.
what I picked up from the bookstore. And it just made me think, oh, stories can be this.
Yeah.
Meaningful, funny, lovable, great characters.
Right.
Definitely is one of them.
Right.
But like you, there's, it depends on my mood or what I'm thinking about her.
Right. I have very fond memories too of reading, stealing away with certain books. There are certain books that I will always feel attached to because of the moments in which I read them, or the context in which I read them. And one of those books for me is A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, where I was actually working my summers during the time where St. Louis was renovating its library, and I worked 2 summers in a row where we took all the books out of the library and hauled them away, and the next summer we moved all the books back into the library. And I remember stealing away during one of those summers, I don't remember which, and reading A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And now every time I pick that up, it's almost become a sensory memory for me, that book. Yeah.
I have a question. So you say you ended the letters ended about 91.
Say that again?
The letters that the family was getting ended in 91.
Oh, right, yeah.
So did you ever have communication with them after this? Like, do those people know that you wrote a book based on those letters? And how do you envision, if they wrote a letter now, finding out about that? How would that go?
Well, my defense has always been, it's not just one person. It's not just one person. Which is true which is always true about fiction. I mean, as much as those, even the story about my mom may have informed the character of Maggie, but she's not the character of Maggie. So much of myself informed, of my experience informed one of the main characters in this book named Lainey. And yet I'm not Lainey. Lainey makes different choices, has different motivations than I do. However, I will admit that question that you asked used to keep me up when I was writing this book. And I said to my mom, do you think person A, who was the primary inspiration for the character, would ever recognize herself in this? And my mom said, are you kidding? Do you know Violet Baumgartner at all? She would never recognize herself in this. And I took some comfort in that until I wrote, The Kids Are Gonna Ask, and I told my mom, you were the inspiration for one of these characters, but I'm not gonna tell you which. She never figured it out. She never figured it out, even though Maggie was bringing strays home and doing even though Maggie was the one who had the contents of her purse strewn all over I-35. I think we see ourselves so differently than others see us that, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. There are actually kind of 2 people, and I believe they both passed away. But yeah, I would feel a little bit, but then on the other hand, I think that Violet as a character, I think she thinks it's glorious that she has an entire book written about her. I think there's nothing that thrills her more. Absolutely nothing. So, in fact, I wrote an entire other novel before this, which ended up getting shelved, and I often in my head, even though Violet as a character came to me much earlier than that book, I often think Violet knew that I was gonna have a practice book. And she waited her time. She bided her time because she knew I wasn't ready for her story. And it wasn't until I was ready that she agreed to show up in full. I mean, maybe that makes me sound a little unstable, but that's honestly how I feel about it.
Well, I bet she saved every single clipping too.
Yes, yes. So, well, I think we're coming up on time, and I know there are refreshments, and shall I turn it over to you, Gary, or shall I adjourn?
Well, let's just say thank you very much.
Yes.